Tonight's show is one to be watching with someone you love, and particularly someone you'd like to love just a little bit better sexually and physically, because we're going to be talking about sexual hang-ups. Hang-ups that get in the way of a full loving expression between two people. We're going to try to discuss where hang-ups come from and how to overcome them, and then how to turn on again sexually. Our guests are Jackie and Jeff Herrigan, a couple who've been married for 15 years and who had for many years hang-ups that made sex unsatisfactory for them, and in the process threatened the foundation of their entire relationship. But they survived, and they overcame their sexual difficulties by facing their hang-ups head-on and by communicating unbelievably openly about sex. They truly learned how to turn on again to loving free. We have an audience of couples with us tonight who later on in the program will ask their own questions about sexual problems. Tonight's show is adult and it is explicit, and we want it to be helpful to you. So right now, I hope that you're watching with someone you love. Good evening. I hope you're having a pleasant night. Stay with us. This is going to be kind of special, I think. Our guests are Jackie and Jeff Herrigan, who've written a book called Loving Free. And as you know, we're going to be talking about some very explicit sexual problems. I think in order to do this, like to kind of get, the ground level that we need, I need to talk to you about your sex life. Something I normally don't do with people if I'm riding next to them on a bus or a plane or something like that. But since we are on TV and you've written a book about it, I want to find out about it, but how close in can I get?
Come on all the way.
As close as you can, as close as it's comfortable
You
for
don't
you.
mind being on television talking about your private?
I'll tell you if you step on any toes.
Oh, maybe that's one of your things. Maybe you'd like to have your toes stepped on. I don't know. All right, let's begin by just a random order of things. Do you use pornography at all?
Yes, we have.
Okay, fine. How about swinging and orgies? Have you got into that scene?
Not at all.
How about affairs with other people?
We've talked about them. We've discussed them thoroughly. Neither one of us has had an affair, and we've been married 15 years.
What about fantasies? Do you have a lot of fantasies?
Lots of them.
Happy fantasy life.
Terrific.
Fun
Do you
fantasy
tell
life.
each other about your fantasies?
Oh,
Yes.
that's half the fun, is sharing it.
All right, good. How about leather and whips? This
No.
is something that's a specialty item on the sexual scene.
Not
No.
our
Not
our thing.
game.
Not your thing at
No.
all. How about bondage?
No.
No,
No things like that?
no.
How about oral sex?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Fun part of our sex life.
Right.
Okay, fine. What about vibrators? I see all kinds of vibrators on sale at all kinds of stores.
If you haven't got one, you should get one. They're terrific.
You're endorsing them,
Yes.
okay? What about making love in places other than bed?
I think it's one of the most intriguing parts of a total sex life, to get out of that bed, and whether it's just moving down to the living room rocking chair, it gives a whole totally different aspect to the same act.
How about combining drugs and sex, as is so popular among many people today? Have you done any marijuana with sex and so forth?
Are you going to? Oh,
Go ahead.
yes.
Yes. Okay. And how about prostitutes? Do you ever consult male or female prostitutes
No.
for your own pleasures?
No, but I think, like most women, I am very curious about prostitutes, and I think they're okay. I think there's a place for them in our society.
How about masturbation as part of your sex life?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Definitely.
Even though you are married?
Definitely.
Well, that's kind of a bit of a rundown. This is a happy middle class, very happy and in love husband and wife. They have 4 children. They're from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they are Catholics. Welcome to the show, Jerry.
Good to be here.
Very good. All right, a couple of things. We want to talk about sexual hang-ups. How different is your sex life now than it was when you were so immersed in as many hang-ups as you had?
It's about as different as it can be, and still be talking about the same two people. When we came into marriage, both of us from a strong Catholic background, and not only just the Catholic thing, coming through the 50s where sex was not talked about, it was non-existent, sweep it under the rug, don't tell them that it might be fun because then they'll go out and get pregnant, and then what are you going to do with them?
And if it's fun, it's got to be a sin.
Right, exactly. Anything that was fun was probably sinful. A total lack of an adequate sex education, so we came to marriage very much in love, started off practicing rhythm, which was the only thing allowed us by the Catholic Church. Rhythm was a disaster for us. We had 3 children in 2.5 years, which further drove our sex life into the ground by...
How religiously did you practice?
Oh,
Did you have
really,
those various techniques?
we really tried everything from the tapes and the thermometers, and my dad's an obstetrician gynecologist. We had a built-in house guru. You know, we had everything going for us, and nothing worked. We got down to the point that it was getting up to 17, 18, 19 days a month, that there could be no sexual relationship at all because of the whole cycle. And it was wedging us. It was driving us apart.
And even at that point, I was terrified every time we had intercourse that I was going to get pregnant. And that was the only thing I could think about during intercourse, so that's got to take...
So that is a gigantic hang-up, the
Right.
birth control thing. What is the nature of some of your other hang-ups that you had to overcome?
Well, oral sex was certainly a very big hang-up. Going back again to our upbringing, the words that were used were nice. They weren't dirty. It was impure thoughts, impure words, impure deeds, impurity, impure actions. You got your whole head going, was that a thought, a deed, or an action as such? And all of this taught that, sex was for procreation, not to be fun. Therefore, oral sex is not for procreation.
Because there's no place in it.
Right. Therefore, it would be impure, improper. So you had this whole heavy thing of wrong, no good, on you. And yet, inside, you read, you heard, people talked, you wondered, you fantasized, you imagined what might it be like. And you had to come to deal with this by sitting down and talking and finding out that it wasn't only my mind that had the thoughts and the wonderments, so too did hers. But again, from our upbringing, you didn't talk about these things. As soon as we talked about them, then we said, what would you think of trying it? On the basis that if we don't like it, or either one of us is uncomfortable, because again, we love each other, there was not a use idea here at all of using another person, we can always back away from something. You aren't locked. You can try something, and we did try it, and we found out it was super terrific.
And it helped you overcome and got you in a lot more pleasure.
Right.
Bill, I think the attitude prevailed across the board, not just with Catholics, on this, if it's fun, it has to be a sin concept, because another friend of mine years later, who never really had any religious affiliation growing up at all, was talking about some of the same kind of hang-ups. And she said, I always felt that if I was enjoying it too much, it had to be dirty. Mm-hmm. And that was a very prevalent attitude when we were coming into marriage.
We were talking, here in town with a woman today that was a black woman who was a Baptist from here in North Carolina. And she started nodding her head. I know what you mean. My religious upbringing, and we've talked to Methodists and Jews and Lutherans, agnostics, and many people have a lot of these ideas, attitudes that were formed in them. The idea of a penis going into a mouth, into a woman's mouth, the idea of licking, tonguing, sucking a penis, has just been to so many people, yuck, And the idea of a man's mouth, lips, tongue, going into the vagina of a woman as such, again, very heavy. And I think even more so, heavier for guys and women.
Right. Let's try to, because you're not afraid and you're willing to be personal and hoping that in the fact that you're going to be as explicit as you both are about your own personal experiences, right, that you're going to help you right out there watching now. What kind of hang-ups did you have, Jeff, about oral sex?
As a man.
As a man, yeah. What were your feelings about it?
First of all, I knew little about a vagina. The whole idea of pictures, art, everything, as I grew up as a little boy and when I was told everything was inside by the very nature of the physiology of a female. I did not know what a clitoris was. I did not know that it brought tremendous sensations to a female, wonderful feelings, and was the main part of her anatomy that led her to an orgasm in the same way that my penis does for me. When I came to understand that I could relate with that clitoris in the same way I could with my own penis, it allowed me with the person I love to want to bring a good feeling and good sensations too. But then I had to overcome the other thing.
There are a lot of other things involved.
Many.
Yeah.
Look at the menstrual period. Now here's the idea of a woman with the flow of blood, and then you hear all these other things and other fluids. And what are other fluids? You don't know. And you think of, you know, the whole idea of the menstrual period. Is it dirty? Is it blood? What are these other fluids? And it sounds like, you know, icky, yucky something, you know, as a young boy. You look at the idea of television today and we see FDS spray advertised, you know, for the female.
If there's a spray, there has to be a reason for it.
Why do we have deodorants to use under our armpits and so on? Why? To knock out foul odors as such, to protect us from. So therefore you have the image, if there's sprays, there must be a foul odor. So now you put together fluids, blood, something I can't see, something and the idea of going down, putting my face next to vagina, putting my mouth in here, was for a young man, for a boy, for a man, like I couldn't relate with this. Why would I do this? Then I found that by discussing it with Jackie and talking about cleanliness and her educating me and telling me more about the female body and so forth, let me come up to, okay, I will try this one time. And I'm very happy to report that after about 2 minutes of the first time I encountered oral sex, all the inhibitions and these things I've just mentioned were blown out completely, and it became a very pleasant experience for me as a man.
The key to what happened in your lives is not just all of a sudden getting bold and daring in terms of sex. I mean, that is, you can interpret it that way on one level. But the real key, as I understand it from just talking to you now and from reading the book and so forth, is the communication. All of a sudden, you open the door, and you revealed your doubts, your fears, your ignorance, what you did know, what you didn't know, your misconceptions, and that really was your doorway to overcoming these hang-ups.
You're right on. That was the whole key.
Okay. We're going to take a pause. Now, another thing we're going to try to do this evening is to talk about some of the ways in addition to this kind of communication, some of the specific ways that people as a unit, as a loving pair, can kind of turn themselves back on again to each other. And we'll get into that after this. Hi, our guests are Jackie and Jeff Herrigan. Their book, the story of their life, their sexual life, as well as the openness and communication that came through a lot of insight and personal growth and knowledge, is contained in this book, Loving Free. We try to get a little bit into how hang-ups can come from different places in people. You know, basically childhood, misconceptions, myths, and so forth. Once you open the door to real communication, and you're not afraid to lay it out straight about what you're afraid of and so forth with each other, and you're ready to be at a point to kind of turn on again sexually after a long period of time, as you had. How did it happen for you? What was the first step in turning on again to each other?
Actually, the first step was being able to talk about it, which is, sex is the hardest thing in the world for two people to talk about on a personal level.
Why is that, though? It's such a personal thing. I mean, why can't it be?
It's that ego trip. If I say to you, if you and I are married, and we've been married for 5 years, the silence and the walls have already been built there, and I turn to you one day and say, Bill, I think we're in a rut. I think our sex life
What do you mean in a rut?
Right, it's that ego thing. I am not going to bring it up because I'm afraid of your fragile ego that's going to be smashed, and it's that reason for holding back. It's so difficult.
And all that kind of communication, or lack of communication, comes from, like, the first time that the cap is left off the toothpaste and you don't say, hey, don't leave the cap off the toothpaste.
Or if I say as a man to her, I don't think our sex life is all that it could be. What's your first reaction?
It's my fault.
Right, something's wrong with me.
But it's really not a case of it being anyone's fault, is it?
No, it's a question of two people getting over that hang-up, or one person getting up enough guts to say, okay, what are my options? I can either leave it this way, unsatisfying for the next 50 years, however long I'm going to live with this man, because I do love him and I intend to keep living with him. I can go in the bathroom and masturbate for the rest of my life, which is very lonely, or I can run off with the milkman. And I don't know that the milkman is going to be any better a lover than Jeff. So
plus, there's another option, which a lot of people do, is simply sublimate all their sexual desires and eat, or get into, painting every room in the house 8 times a year.
We've named 4 alternatives, right?
Right.
Do you think most people would choose any one of those?
No, I don't think so. But
don't either.
frequently, it's difficult for people to have the guts
That's,
Right.
to choose the honest route, to choose just being direct and open.
And what they're looking for is an easy way to do it. Once you get your courage built up that first time.
Why don't you mention the first thing
What-
we did?
Yeah, what happened? That's really
Okay.
what I want to find out. There has to be, every journey begins with one
One
step.
little step.
What was the
right.
step?
The step was Jeff came home from a business trip. Now, bear in mind, we didn't know it, but this had been on both of our minds for about a year.
How to deal with it. How
Right.
to deal with it.
Jeff came home from a business trip. I was sitting on the bed. He was unpacking his suitcase, and he had one of the marriage manuals of the day, 15 years ago, 14 years ago. And he, very casually, as he unpacked, tossed it on the bed and said, "Hey, I picked this up at the airport in Denver, and it really has some very interesting things in it." Well, what he had done was underline
The stuff
everything.
that he was interested in.
Right, like oral
Clever
sex.
man.
Right. Now, if he had thrown that book at me and said, "Here, you ought to read this. It'll do you some good," my pride would have been wounded. I would not have touched the book with a 10-foot pole. But my curiosity was aroused instead. I wanted to see what he found was interesting, and it also gave me a safe way a couple days later to come back and say, "Okay, I read the book and I saw that you had this underlined and this and this. What were you thinking about, when you underlined that section on oral sex?" And that was the first time in our lives that we really could sit down and talk on a one-to-one basis.
That was the key.
That was the key.
first thing.
Another thing that we started doing right after that was the first step, was trying to learn some technique, both of us, quietly. And I guess you can talk about it and act later, or you can act and talk about it later, or you can do both simultaneously. And we were
You mean
kind
with the book in your hand?
No.
Oh.
Talk about your sex life and act later to liven
right.
it up.
For example, after going through the discussions over many weeks that the book opened up, I remember one night saying, as we were in bed and we were very close and very tender, I said, "Would you take my hand and take it where you would like it to go and show me more of what would be pleasurable for you?" Now, she didn't have to say anything at this point. She could just take my hand.
Because you were willing to
Right.
be shown.
Shown.
Your ego wasn't in the way of
Right.
saying, "Nobody has to show me. I know what to do."
I loved and I wanted in love to bring something to her. Yeah, and that would be fulfilling for me too. I'd feel pretty good if I could. And she would take my hand and then she'd say softer, harder. She would, so I wouldn't hurt, so it would be just, and then, the next time or a day or two later, we might be again making love and she might say, "Now take my hand, teach me more about you." And this again, slowly, gently, was the moving forward,
Together.
Right.
Together.
What I meant before, by acting and talking later, this is another big hang-up. People don't seem to feel, I certainly didn't, that I had a right to ask for what pleased me in sex. And one of the things that we found was very easy, a simple way to get around that, was without saying a word, to take his hand and move it to where I wanted it, use my hand on top of his to show him how much pressure or how much gentleness was needed there, and give him the idea without any verbalization at all. Then later on, as it got easier, it became easier for us to talk about it.
See, I think, for example, Bill, a lot of women, don't know that if a man's testicles are hit hard or squeezed hard, it hurts. It hurts a lot. And if they've ever seen a little boy get hit in the groin with a baseball off a bat, or if they wonder why men wear supporters in athletics, it's so that those testicles don't bump into each other and get hit because it hurts.
Just talking about it.
Hurts,
Yes.
right? So sometimes a female may, the woman may be trying to bring something by touch and feeling and thinking, gee, I'll bet, this will give you a sensation when I squeeze. Now, if it hurts me a little bit or a lot, do I say, "That hurts, would you make it a little softer? I don't want you to go away."
Right.
Or do I bite the bullet and take it because I don't want to hurt her feelings? And we've got to learn to be honest and say, "This is really neat, but a little softer, it's hurting." Hurting, she may say, "What do you mean hurting?" I say, "Well, now I can tell you about my body, about my testicles. They hurt if there's, in the same way that I need her to tell me about her body." It was beautiful one time. Jackie said to me, "Let me show you in detail my body." You're my husband. I love you very much. I feel very safe with you. Let me show and teach you things about my body. And she did these things, and I could see for the first time a clitoris. I'd never seen this before. Let me tell you how this feels. And now I'm talking, you know, months, and months are going by. You're getting safer and safer. You're opening like little flowers with the safety of love.
But there were still many, many hang-ups there. It took years. This did not happen in a week.
Yeah, I think it's important to underscore that it was a growing, loving process between a man and a wife over a long period of time.
And there were many hang-ups that lasted for quite a long time. I had, because of my Catholic upbringing and the fact that sex should not be fun, it should be for the reproduction of children, anything artificial had to be dirty. In other words, you couldn't bring a vibrator into your sex life, because that was lewd. Right. And Jeff did a very, very clever thing. He went out and bought a vibrator, put it under the pillow one night. We were making love. The lights were out, and all of a sudden, the vibrator was zzz, and it was going. Before I had a chance to let my hang-ups come out, the sensation was so terrific that I thought, the heck with those hang-ups, forget them. I'll worry about them tomorrow morning.
What I see in that activity of you, Jeff, as a husband, is really understanding the best way to communicate. And again, we come back to the same point. You know, we're not talking about wild, orgy-like experimentation. We're talking about sensitivity and knowing how to grow and progress together. I want to find out how you used pornography.
Okay.
And how you felt about that, because, you know, there's a kind of a moral issue there in what is involved in pornography.
Again, the whole background. Look, when I was a little boy, 10 years old, the 8-pagers came into school with the little drawings.
Oh,
and
the drawings.
The big little books, and the, you know, and these kinds of things, and the quick picture.
2x4s.
2x4s, right?
I never saw one of those.
No? Wait.
For you.
Just kidding. I haven't seen one for a long time.
Well, now we've gotten, you know, we've come along a lot further, and I think we have to understand that in Denmark and Sweden and many other countries where people like you and I are living, fine, decent people, have, you know, done some other things, comes to America, you know, our movies open up, our Playboys and all these kinds of things are all part of this, and now we come up to movies or films or magazines and so forth. So I felt, okay, I've always looked at these from time to time, so I bought some and I brought them home and I said, have you ever really seen a good, you know, porno magazine? And here was a magazine, and here were couples and orgies and all kinds of positions and oral sex and, you know, everything you could imagine, homosexuals and so forth. And a tape. We brought a tape home also, and looking at different things. Well, we found out neither one of us got much out of tapes, of just listening to something. I think so much is sight. It's suggestive and so forth. Now, were we doing this instead of having a relationship? No, the idea that we came to was it was stimulating, but obviously if I was stimulated, my expression and desire was here. It might say, hey, you know, look at that. Does that sound like it could be interesting? And she said, not only interesting, it looks like it'd be a terrific position for a female, that it would really be a great feeling and accentuate. Why don't we try this and see?
Or, almost more important, if I looked at something and I said, ugh, that's disgusting, it gave him a vehicle to say, tell me why.
Right, and for further growth. But you have 4 children. How would you have felt if your kids stumbled across some of your porno that you might have hidden somewhere?
At that time, I think very uncomfortable. I've come to realize now, our children are 9, 11, 12, and 14, that the happy hooker is going around the 7th grade classes. The kids are learning far more on the playground than I ever learned in college, I think.
And thereby eliminating the potential for the kind of hang-ups you have. I wonder whether or not it would create other hang-ups.
Well, let me give you an illustration. If I sat with my son, 14, who's just finished 8th grade, and I'd show him, here's a porno magazine, if you haven't already seen one, and here's people into orgies, and here's people into homosexualities, and I'd say, Eric, this is not what Mom and I choose. And I'd tell him why and what we find. But here's what people are doing. And you know, see this picture over here? Mom and I looked at that one time, and we thought, for us, it gave us an idea of something we could do. But this we do not choose as a lifestyle, but it helps us get an idea that brings us closer together or more excitement. And over here, Eric, is a beautiful book called Joy of Sex. I'd love you to look at this. I think it's great for definition and illustration. And I would have the alternatives to show him the value judgments in love as husband, wife, mom, dad, what we are looking at, and we're talking honestly, directly. This is what's out there, and I'm trying to equip him to be able to make his choices as we've made ours.
What do you say to the people who really see pornography as a major moral and ethical threat to our society?
That I don't think it's possible to legislate morality in this country. I don't think well, if there's 15 people in this room, I don't think any two of the 15 of us has the same standard of morality, and I will probably not have the same standard next year that I have today. I'm a growing, changing person. And I just don't think it's possible to legislate one common good for all. What is right for us, we are not advocating for other people. I don't expect swingers and wife swappers to come in and say to us, because you haven't chosen this, you don't have a full sex life. To each his own.
Right, I got right where you are. We're going to take a pause. We've got some more interesting things coming up after this. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying being with us, and hope the time you're spending right now staying awake is making it worth your while to be watching the late Bill Boggs. We're talking to Jackie and Jeff Herrigan. We've also been joined by 98% of our studio audience tonight. They have a few questions for Jackie and Jeff. Leon, let's start with you.
Well, I would like to just hear their comment on a comment I heard on a late talk night show with Ricardo Montalban. He was chided about being a Latin-type lover, and he made the comment that a real lover is a man who can make one woman happy.
I am
question.
with him all the way. The whole idea, I think, that has been laid on many of us is that sex automatically gets stale after you've been married a certain amount of time. It gets in a rut, it gets dull. You can't possibly find each other exciting after 15 years. And I think, at least it's happened for us, and I can't believe that it shouldn't be otherwise, it ought to get better, not worse. It's like orchestrating a symphony. The first time you do it, you're fumbling. The second time you do it, you may learn a little bit more about the same woman, or the same man. The third, fourth, 10 years out, you ought to be really superb.
The orchestra leader, so to speak. To use that metaphor, it should be orchestrated.
You ought to know every musician in your band, which...
The Leonard Bernstein.
Right, right. And to me, the ideal sex life is not going out and finding 42 other people at an orgy to liven things up. It's teaching this man and having him teach me as much as we can about each other to make it really super every time.
I think it's important that what the last point you made too, that it goes both ways. It isn't just the man, that it's the woman coming to become a great lover too for that man. You know, and
That was a good question, Leon.
it really was.
BB on the back row. Your thought is?
I'd just like to know what your views on premarital sex are and how you think it affects your married life.
How it affected our married life, it didn't affect it at all, except possibly negatively. We did both have premarital sex.
With each other?
With each other,
Yeah.
and with several other people. But it didn't help us one bit to be free, because it was back in those days, and I think it's still pretty much the same for high school sex today. It was hurried, it was backseat of the car, it was the whole atmosphere that it took place in was furtive, and it didn't add anything to you. You came away from it feeling that all the people that told you sex was dirty were probably right, and under those circumstances, it was, excuse me, it really wasn't very good for the woman. Today, in a different context, talking about living together before marriage, that's a whole different thing than that backseat of the car. I feel that maybe what the kids today are trying to do in living together before marriage is avoid the first marriage for many people today, 1 in 3 that failed, and get some of the kinks out, not only sexually, but the toothpaste cap that's never on and the hair in the sink. I am for adults, 18 and up, who have a place and who can handle the guilt and the pressures that are going to be put on them from their parents. I'm not against it if
What
they can
about
handle
those
it.
pressures and those parents of a different era, a different time, seeing their daughter and and another guy sharing a pad together, what do you say to them when they just don't have the grounds of within their own reason to understand why it has to be that way?
I would say this to those parents, which, excuse me, Bill, these are the people, I'm 40, these are the people 40, 45, and 50 today who go, and I'd say, look, what model are our youngsters seeing, the young people? Is our example of 1 in 3 marriages that nifty to follow? What is the marriage preparation? What do we offer them at the churches or the schools as such? Can you come up with an alternative? And if the answer is, well, we never had to do it, I'd say, fine. In the 50s, it was 1 in 5 divorcing. And I think what Bibi's maybe saying over here, too, is the people today are saying, I value my life. I do not want a lot of pain, fracturing, divorcing with children, and all these kinds of things, and the hurt and the agony that I have seen so much of if I'm in my 20s, as such.
Sure.
And I think you'd have to say, what's the alternative? And honestly, I don't know one because I haven't seen the schools and the churches roll up their sleeves and dig in.
Now, as a
Yes.
parent of 4 children,
You've got a lot of it ahead of you.
right,
Ah,
absolutely. And I can sit here right now because my oldest is 14, and I can be very unhung up about it
Check
until
back in
he
about
gets to be
4 or 5
18,
years, yeah.
and then I'll let you know what's going on inside of me.
And I think what we're trying to do is come up on society's new legal age of 18 as parents with our son at 14, bringing him up with all of the input we can and as much open discussion to allow him to make his choices. And at 18, should he decide to live with someone, so forth, I think I can feel comfortably today, that we will have talked enough about it to have enough confidence that he's using his head and trying to reach out for as good a life as he can, because we're also trying to teach him, our kids, not to use other people and things of this sort.
Which is a good point. Cecil, I know you have a question. You wouldn't be sitting there otherwise.
Yes, my question is, since you do have children that are growing up and reaching, the marrying age, what would be your procedure about schooling them about, their sex life and, sexual behavior and sexual hang-ups?
Right. Cecil, as we've traveled across America with our book Loving Free, from Seattle to Philadelphia, from Miami to Minneapolis, and here in Greensboro, people have exactly the same question. There's nothing different here in Greensboro than in our city of Milwaukee. I have yet to see or become aware of major good programs in the churches or in the schools along this line. And everybody says, then let's do it at home. Recently on Barbara Walters' show on NBC, some psychologists and counselors were talking, and they said, we've got to use tools. If parents could sit down with books, not hand them to the kid and say, go read this. And they recommended The Joy of Sex for definition and illustration. We were very pleased that they also mentioned Loving Free for applied living together. Now, if parents and kids could discuss this in the same way we discuss eating, in the same way we discuss sleeping, the natural things of life, or going to a ball game, and with the mom and dad teaching, and then personalizing it and trying to tell, we do this. This is part of our life. Because naturally, if you don't tell them that, the kid wonders, do you do that? Do you do this? And I think the most meaningful way we can teach is from our own personal experience, knowing that I love Jackie, she loves me, and I can sit with the children, show them the pictures, the different positions for sexual intercourse, the female organs, the male organs, the beauty of the penis and all that it was meant to be. If we're religious people, these are God-made bodies, if you want to think of it that way. They can't, they're not ugly, dirty, as such, and deal with this openly, honestly, and then be able to continue discussions, not just the one visit, and then have fathers tell their daughters what a man feels like, what goes through a man. Have mothers tell their sons, and vice versa. So it isn't just mom off with the girls and dad off with the boys. Interrelate and bring it together.
You know what my thought is as you're saying this? It's almost too utopian, though. It's so idealistic. You got people who are making love in the dark because they're afraid to look at each other with their clothes on.
Right.
How are they going to get, and get a book out and tell their 15-year-old kid about it?
I think the way we break through, Bill, is for if you are a dad or are one day, if Cecil is, if Phoebe is, if we are, and we begin, Cecil will start to tell his friends what he's doing. Nothing changes like this. But if Cecil says, I've had the most wonderful visit with my kids, And it was just terrific. The kids were so grateful. Now his friend Harry hears this and goes home and talks to his wife Mildred and says, guess what Cecil did? We have to snowball.
Cecil did that?
Yes. And if
Cecil did it, we can do it.
If we have successful experiences we will share with other people. You know, if you were to sit down with your kids and say, I can't tell you, Jeff, the most beautiful visit I've had with my children about sex, you know, was just super terrific, and they were so responsive. I'm going to have more. They were so good. And I'm not sure they'll have more questions as they get older and go through different experiences, the psychological sides, the human. And then if she tells me, that's going to encourage me to do the same with my children.
Communication is the key.
Yeah.
I mean,
We're right back to it.
We're back to that same point again, aren't
Do we have to break here, or can I say something?
No, we got one other person with a question, but go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say,
Sure.
you know, if you can create an open atmosphere in the home so that you don't give them the one-shot birds and the bees talk.
Like the long ride in the car.
Yeah,
saying,
oh, right, but then
Right.
the subject is closed
Yes.
forever.
No,
Don't ever
don't
bring
say
it up
anything.
again
I've
because
done
it's
it. I've
embarrassed
done
me,
it.
so, right. When, you know, little kids ask natural questions. If you answer them naturally then, it leaves them with the feeling, okay, the next time I have a question, I can ask it. Whether grandma's there for dinner or not, just answer it like you would answer a question about what makes the grass
Grandma's
grow.
been through a little bit of life.
Yeah.
It's not going to disturb her
Right.
too much.
Well, it might, but even so, they're your children, and who cares more about them and who's more responsible for them than you are? We had a funny thing happen. Our 14-year-old has one whole wall in his room that's bulletin boards, and it's posters of motorcycles leaping, and it's posters of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and everything else, and he has one Playboy centerfold up there. Now, for a 14-year-old boy, that's the most natural, normal thing in the world. And I go into his room as rarely as possible because it's such a mess. But I did walk in one day, and Jeff's parents were coming to visit, and I knew they'd be in and out of Eric's room. And I thought, should I tell him to take
That's
that down?
an interesting
Okay.
thing, because there you've got your own relationship with
Right.
your
Right.
adults above you.
And Grandma and Grandpa
Yeah.
are 74, and they're going to be very shocked by this. Now,
Yeah.
do I turn my relationship with Eric and him into a hypocrite overnight, or do I try and deal with it with Grandma and Grandpa? And so I didn't say anything to Eric at all. And when Jeff's parents came, Grandpa, of course, brought up, oh, Eric's got a nude up in his room. And I said, do you mean to tell me in 8th grade you never sat, you know, with a bunch of boys in a garage and looked at a picture of a nude girl? And I said, isn't it better? I said, you look at that wall. If it was all nudes, it would upset me. But it's so well balanced. He's into sports. He's got a picture of O.J. Simpson. I said, Grandpa, that's his life, and that's where he's at.
And Grandpa
And
said, in those days, they were only in black and white.
And then Grandma said, as she said, you know, we knew what they were thinking. Grandma said, I think it's just terrific.
Good.
I just think it's wonderful, it's normal and natural, and you sit back and you find all of a sudden you had presumed and made a judgment for Grandma and Grandpa, and you found out they only wished they had been able to do the same thing from their day.
Which is the whole other thing we can talk about, the concept of not being truthful with someone because you think it'll hurt their feelings.
Right.
We can get into that maybe later. Joyce, I know you have a question.
Well, I was more interested in what you think about sex education in institutions. Our schools are so sterile, it seems to me, in their education, but what could churches do?
Joyce, I think you're right in the schools. The public schools are in a tough situation with taxpayers, and I'm sure at your school, my school, we've seen the idea, should we bring the program in, and all of a sudden it's a 10-to-1 swamping, and they go down, it should be done in the home. I believe the churches have the opportunity. This is the entity in community life that could do it, and do it well, because again, what framework are they coming from? Theology, God, the whole thing. And if they could bring it in, they're the ones that have the opportunity. But not only for children, for people our age too, and for people 50, that there is a beautiful sex life after 50 and after 60 and after 70, and these are not abnormal things. I think that this could be just super terrific. But when we come to a background of, you know, don't wear the black patent leather shoes, don't wear red dresses, you stimulate boys, put phone books on your lap if you're ever going to see the girl on your thing. That's the stuff of the past that is so destructive. I wish the churches would decide to get with it.
Good point.
Do you think there's a possibility that they...
Here and there, we hear in some towns, the Lutherans, for example, in Indiana, are really getting a nifty program going, and there's pockets starting.
But do you know what we need first? We need qualified people
Teachers.
who can teach a sex education course. And none of our colleges are turning out anybody in this field. The few places that do have it, throw it to the poor physical education teacher. Okay, you take the girls in 7th grade and give them the little talk about menstruation.
It really doesn't go as far as it has to go in order to take care of the creation of that kind of hang-ups we were talking about right at the outset of the show. We're going to take a break and continue with this most interesting couple after this. You know, if we're trying to get into sexual hang-ups and turning on to each other again, there's really one thing that we'd be negligent if we didn't discuss, and that is something I think is uniquely American, maybe not though, and that is the whole concept of the performance level in sex. Sex is something beyond loving, something that is like a performance with all kinds of expectations of self and partner and everything. How do you relate to this? Have you worked through this?
We sure have. And why don't you talk about it from the man's point of view first, and then I'd like to come back and talk about it from the woman's point of view.
Well, you know, first of all, when you're a man, you can't pass it off. You can't fake it. You
You almost sound like John Wayne saying that.
Right.
You can't pass it up, Buster.
I mean, you either have an erection or you don't, you know, and as such. And I think there's so many guys that get so uptight about this, or they'll hear the great locker room stories of, I did it 4 times last night. You know, I lasted 18 minutes each time, you know, and all of a sudden, my Lord, what's wrong with me if I'm, you know, lasting 2 minutes and I can't get it on a second time, as such. The pressures, I think, very heavy on the male to perform, have handicapped a lot of guys. I think they've gotten inferiority complexes, they've gotten uptight, and so forth. Whereas the woman can fake it if she wants to, or could fake it. He knows he's exposed, you know, it's just there, wide open. And then he gets this whole trip that been laying us through the red books and everything else over the last several years of, the woman writing, I had 19 orgasms in a given night. Now, it's obviously, my God, if I can't bring 19 orgasms, what's wrong with me? The numbers game. And then the other one of the simultaneous orgasm is the crescendo and the summit level. Right.
Yes.
And if you can't do it, you know, are you there, boom, you know, the explosion, then something's wrong with me because I can't bring it. So all these performance standards that pile up, I think really just scare the hell out of a lot of guys. Now, what we need to do is think this through, really, and knock all that kind of stuff in the head. We have had some simultaneous orgasms.
That occurred purely by accident.
They haven't felt any different.
Work it out.
That's what you'd have to do. You'd have to start out early in the day because that's putting such an incredible pressure on 2 people to make it happen at once. And it didn't ever occur to me until long after I read all these marvelous articles and books saying that this was the ultimate in sexual experience, that at least for me it wasn't. That I could enjoy my orgasm much more all by myself and then enjoy Jeff's all by itself when it occurred than when they happened together.
And we may have had it, maybe, I'm just guessing, you know, 10 times in our years that we maybe had a simultaneous orgasm. I don't sure I even knew it was occurring. It just, you know, talked about it later. It didn't feel any different for me. You know,
that's the funny thing.
You know,
You're both so involved in your own that you end up a little bit later saying, did you? You know, and you didn't realize it even happened simultaneously half the time.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go back to the pressure on women. Which
that's what I want to find. Tell us about your situation.
There was no pressure on me until the women's movement started. And I was very happily going along. He was supposed to please me, and that was the way the game was played. And when the women's movement came along, every magazine you picked up, every book that was being written on the subject was putting the new pressure standards not only on men to perform, but on women to become multiply orgasmic. And, you know, all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, my 1 or 2 or 3 little orgasms did not seem like enough. Gertie Gulch in New Mexico was having 93 in a minute and 14
Guinness
seconds.
Book of World Records.
Right.
As reported
And what
in
does that
Guinness
say?
Books,
What's the matter with me? If she can have 93 and she's 45 years old, what's the matter with me? And we started playing that game for a very short time, and the pressure was on Jeff. He was reading the same articles and thinking, what's the matter with me if I can't give her 93 in a minute and 15 seconds? And we finally had to say, hey, stop. Nobody's keeping scorecard on the bedroom wall. And we're starting to wave this bed sheet around like a banner in some new cause, and that's what we've been talking about getting away from. everybody's different on a different night. Let's say I painted the garage today and I took 42 Cub Scouts out to have pizza and I'm tired. Maybe I won't even have one orgasm tonight. And that's okay because I know my body's tired. It has no reflection on him. Tomorrow night's a different
And it's
story.
no one's fault.
Right.
No.
It's not a
And you'll
fault.
still
factor
have good
involved.
feelings of some kind.
Right.
And his ego should not be down if he has one and I don't have one.
And we discovered too that we could find that we can bring pleasure, enjoyment, orgasm to each other at times without having intercourse. You know, by manually, by using your hands or the vibrator that we talked about earlier, using oral sex and so forth to bring pleasure and joy. I may be very, very exhausted. I may not be in a mood. You know, I may not, I think to myself, I don't think I could get an erection if I tried tonight. Well, that doesn't mean I can't bring some pleasure to her, and I can manually in some way. And surprisingly, half the time, I get the erection.
You know what I was thinking before when you were talking about all the things, all the pressure to have orgasms, and this subject, in a way, your book and the fact that we're talking about this is related to the whole gigantic amount of attention that is directed right now in the United States toward sex. It's almost like, you know, we all of a sudden the last couple of years have just discovered it. Now it's okay to talk about it on TV. Look, we're doing it right now and everything like that. Do you think there is a danger in our being so tuned into sex? Wouldn't it be better if we were just kind of taking it in a more spontaneous route, not having to have books and not having to...
If you can kick your own hang-ups and if you can feel, and I think that's the whole message that underlies our book in communications and in the sex area, that there's just the two of you, and that's all that really matters in your relationship, and you find your comfort level. It doesn't matter whether the people next door swing or whether they're still back in the Victorian age. You find what's right for you. Untangle your own hang-ups, get close to each other, understand each other, and then go from there and find what suits you. And it may not be the same as what suits Bill Boggs,
But that's okay.
But that's okay.
And you shouldn't be influenced by what suits your
Right.
neighbors, because you just have to find your own level of
Your
love
own
and
level of
enjoyment.
comfort is so.
Yeah.
I think of two things too. Joyce was mentioning earlier sex education. I think of one Catholic priest I heard up giving a speech one time to men and women on marital bliss, you know, through human sexuality. And he would tell you all of these things, this is good, this is right, this is fine, do this, this is not, you know, this, so on and so forth. And I sat and I listened, and I really didn't walk out with too much because I didn't feel, I was sure he knew what he was talking about. Another priest another time said, talking to a group, let's talk about human sexuality. For too long we've buried it. If we could bring it to the same way we talk about food and sleep and thirst. And he said, to start out, I'd like to tell you about my problem that I've had with masturbation through most of my celibate career and how I've dealt with it and where I'm at now and how I've come to... That
That's
guy
very
I
upfront.
listened
Yeah.
to,
Very upfront.
you know, and I'm sure if his bishop had heard him, there would have been a drumming out. But all of a sudden he was totally credible because from his experience, and his experience was different than mine. But I was impressed with how did he relate with it and how did he deal with it. And all of us finding a credible point. And our credible point is not the people next door.
Not the headlines in the magazine.
Not Red Book. Not what you do. Not what Dr. Wham Bam says in his manual. It's what we do, where our comfort level, where our joy level, and discovering it together.
We have to take a break. We've got one or two more interesting things at the end of the show. We'll be right back after this. Well, along about this hour, we just start closing things out. And I have a couple closing things I'd like to get into. One is this. We've been sitting here for a whole hour using these interesting language terms. Like we've used, you know, kind of clinical terms like penis and vagina and testicles and so forth because we're on TV. I mean, let's face it. That's the reason we're talking like this. We wouldn't normally be using, you know, just always say oral sex. There would be other terms we'd be using. How do you relate to working on this level, talking about this subject?
In our book, Loving Free, we have a whole chapter on this.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. I've been very conscious to use words like penis, vagina, testicles, breasts, and so forth. And that is not the language we talk in at home. Now, I'm not saying we go way gross to the other side, because again, this is a person I love. But we'll have terms that are ours. Some, I'm sure you've heard most of them. Maybe we have a few we develop of our own that we talk. When I don't say, Jackie, would you like to go upstairs and have intercourse tonight? You know, no. It'll come out a lot more fun or carefree and so forth in different language. So here we are on TV, and we're all working to not quite talk in the same words in respect to television and other people's
public airways,
sensitivities.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the show, you know. We had a list of things we really knew we couldn't say.
Yeah.
Then we had a middle ground area that we thought if we slipped one by, maybe nobody would notice, but we decided to be kind of conservative.
And I think, you know, you find...
I'm sorry, all the people sitting out there listening,
They know it.
no, gee, that's not the way I talk.
Right.
You know.
And I think that's wonderful, because I think just as you sometimes will take out, you know, a screwdriver to tighten some things, you know, this is I'm trying to, you know, pass along an inference here in an allowable way on television, and that is a word that can be fun, you know, again, with the person you love. And when you've come to a language and words that are comfortable, there's a few that are not comfortable for us. We've kind of ruled out that are objectionable.
There's one other thing. In the book, I made a lot of notes. It's really a thumb-worn edition here, but I underlined one sentence that I thought maybe be a nice point to close on. That was, you make the statement, people have the right to ask for what gives them pleasure.
In sex.
In
oh,
sex.
Why can't we do that? You go to a restaurant and you look at the menu and you think, wow, lobster really turns me on tonight. That's what I want. Why did somebody years ago took our sex life and put it way up there in the corner outside of, you know, your regular life? And I feel very comfortable at a cocktail party if somebody says, you know, do you want black olives or green olives? I'll tell them. But it's so hard to tell him. And you have the right to do that. Sometimes it's hard, and sometimes maybe a little way of doing it would be here, not there is better.
So it's obvious that we can conclude the show on this point. Think lobster. We'll see you next week with Sybil.
So what does a wonderful Hall of Fame broadcaster, Bob Costas, have to say after reading Spike Unleashed? Well, old dog? Not really. New tricks? Plenty. Turns out Spike has more to say and more encounters with the virtuous and villainous figures of our time than any other person, let alone canine, I know. Thank you very much, Bob Costas, for liking Spike Unleashed.
Order Spike Unleashed today. It's a roller coaster ride of comical suspense. OrderSpike.com takes you right to the Amazon order page. That's www.orderspike.com.